Greetings on this 25th day of February 2000. Welcome to this segment of the Living History of USC, sponsored by the USC Emeritus Center. This involves conversations or interviews with eminent individuals who have had long and very close associations with the university and have been instrumental in its development and its rise to its current eminence as a major university. Today, I have the privilege of conversing with Herbert E. Farmer, Professor Emeritus of Cinema, who's been at the university for over 60 years. I'll be rather familiar since I've known Herb since my early days at USC. Herb arrived at USC in 1938 with one of his high school friends from Buffalo, New York, Dan Wiegand, both planning to attend the new film school. During their first day at USC, they met Dave Johnson. He was then a psychology major but switched to cinema. And all three of these individuals ended up teaching for many years at the university. Both Dan and Dave have long since retired, but Herb still spends 5 very long days each week in his office and archives of film equipment, photographic equipment, and films in the basement of the Norris Theater. He is really a worker. Now, Herb began teaching in the Department of Cinema in 1942 when he was a senior student, mainly because many of the faculty were entering the services during World War II. In 1943, he entered the U.S. Navy and was in the Navy until 1946. When he was discharged, he returned to USC with his new bride, Beatrice, who was a Navy nurse. In 1954, he received his master's in cinema and had continued his teaching and went on teaching a variety of courses in the department. He served in the department for a period as associate chair. He's been very, very active. His many involvements at USC include coaching game films in both football and other sports under practically every athletic director, and he was caretaker of the coaching films. He was treasurer of the Faculty Center Association. He's a 58-year member of Skull and Dagger Society, very active in the cinema fraternity, and well, he's been not only active here at USC, but he has taken more than 15 trips abroad representing USC. He was particularly privileged in 1965 to serve as a delegate to the Soviet Union. In those days, few Americans were permitted to go because of the early Cold War. He visited film industry and film schools in that country. He still is active nationally in attendance at film conferences, many each year or two. Herb is a true Trojan. Tell me about your family, Herb, and do you have any hobbies or avocations?
I have one son, a lovely daughter-in-law, and 2 lovely granddaughters. Jim went to USC, came to USC as a freshman and went through his undergraduate program, finished his master's degree in physical education and exercise sciences. His wife was a student at USC, I think a student in his class at one particular time, but actually she was in journalism and is working at the present time with the Orange County Register. And the two girls are in school. The oldest one is a freshman in high school, and the second one is a sixth grader, I think. We see them regularly, but we are very, very different. My family's always been that way. As a youngster, my father and mother were very understanding, and we all did our own thing, more or less. I had an older brother, 10 years older, who his hobby was amateur radio and was as long as he lived. And he could take code faster than I could make notes. It worked beautifully. My younger brother got all the music in the family, except that I like to play the sousaphone, the space horn, and that is the tuba and the trombone. But we did our own thing. And I was more interested in photography and motion pictures. And all the way through high school, I went to the theater regularly. And in those days, kept up with the current films and the current pictures that were being produced. I loved to go to the downtown theaters and hear the pipe organ and all that went with it. But we worked on occasion with a newsreel company, a couple of early photographers who used to go out covering various events. And we were the camera case carriers, that is Dan Wiegand and I, from the same high school. And it was a good experience, and I began to feel more like I wanted to make a career out of that somehow. I didn't know quite how.
What did you do in the Navy, Herb, during your service? I recall, I think, that you taught there?
Yes, I was fortunate enough to have finished my degree, my bachelor's degree, before I was ready to go into the service. But I'd had considerable contact with the Navy even during the year after I graduated, between 42 and 43. We had a naval pre-flight program going on campus, and I knew the people responsible there. And one of my extra duties, shall I say, during that year was to entertain 600 naval pre-flight cadets on campus with motion pictures. And we equipped Hancock Auditorium with projection equipment and had 2 screenings of studio prints of films and 2 projectors on a pair of projectors that I wouldn't want to try any good film on anymore, because we still have them in the archives. Yes. But in 1943, I did go into the service and went through photo school at Pensacola. Went on to Washington and got into photo interpretation, and suddenly found myself involved with much more with aerial photography and photo interpretation and aerial film processing than I did in motion pictures. What I wanted to do, if I had my choice, would have been in the Naval Motion Picture Unit, because they had a very good program going. But it didn't work that way, and I enjoyed the whole period in the service. Finally leaving Washington, going to Norfolk for a while, and then going out to Hawaii and on out to Guam and Okinawa, and setting up a base photo lab to process film. And we were mapping Japan at the time, and processing them, printing the film, and sending it to the various commands that needed the information. Unfortunately, they didn't have to use the information that was received from it because the war ended rather abruptly. And it was a tragedy, but at the same time, it was less of a tragedy than it would have been otherwise. Well, I was supposed to be the low-point man in the outfit, the last one to leave to come home to the States. But strange as it may seem, I had dispatch orders from Washington to go back to Pensacola and head up the motion picture camera school. Oh. And so I went back to Pensacola, which is where I met Bea and where our life together started. That's naval career. It was very interesting. I ran into 2 of my friends who were in the service who were just leaving Okinawa, including Dan Wiegand, who had been with the Marine Corps on Okinawa. And we met just as I was arriving and just as he was leaving. And fortunately, we got together when we came back to school later on.
How did you find out about and get interested in coming to USC?
Well, I'd been interested in motion pictures and photography for years. It'd been in the family. Although my father was a dentist, he was a hobbyist with photography and had cameras, a good old Graflex.
Oh, yes.
After he got through with the plate camera that he had used before he had the Graflex, I should say. And then later on he got a 16 millimeter camera, about 1930. I could pin that down kind of because it's when we moved from downtown Buffalo out to the suburbs. And I built a darkroom in the basement of the house we lived in where I could process film and used to do a lot of photography that way. But about that time I was interested in amateur movies and made a few short films and realized that I wasn't really interested particularly in the creative side of filmmaking as much as I was the technology of making it happen, putting it all together and knowing all the processes that are involved. I was first considering going to school at Rochester Institute of Technology.
Oh.
And I had even gone so far as make inquiries there. But I didn't really care about making film. I didn't really care about that side of the business. I was more interested in production.
Of course, Rochester is the home
Yes,
of Eastman.
Eastman, and it was just down the road, about
Yes.
60 miles. And I had looked over the situation. But then I read in one of the amateur magazines, Amateur Movie Makers magazine, I believe, about a new school that was being started, that had been started out in Los Angeles.
Yes.
And I read the article, I read it again, wrote for some material. And when I announced that I wanted to go to California to school, there was no resistance whatsoever.
Wonderful.
Do it. At the same time, in high school, I'd been quite involved with music, for one thing, playing in the band and all that sort of thing, but at the same time, management of the auditorium and the stage crew and all the things that happened in the auditorium, including putting on Pirates of Penzance and Mikado. Jimmy Whitmore played the Lord Executioner, the famous movie star,
great.
in the Mikado. He went to the same high school.
Oh,
And I was the business manager of that particular show and took care of the budget and the tickets and all that sort of thing, and played in the orchestra as well. But I knew I wanted to get into the business somewhere, and I wasn't particularly interested in the creative side of it, that is, the writing, the directing, the producing, from the creative side, but rather from the business side.
Nice.
And I've been doing that ever since.
Yes, and I know your course in business and film, you continued to teach until fairly recently.
I taught that right along, and of course the interesting problem was to watch that change as the state of the art changed. In the early days, it was one thing. My interest in movies had started, I can recall going to silent movies.
Yes.
There was a theater right across the street from our house, and I can recall the theater up at the corner. The folks lived in downtown Buffalo, and that's when we moved out to Snyder after that, out into the country. But I can recall the theater up at the other corner with a big sign in the front of it. Sound has arrived, and all that sort of thing.
Yes.
Big banners, very interesting. And I was just interested in that whole thing
Oh, yes.
from the beginning.
And did you see the jazz singer?
And I decided to go, and we decided to go. And I won't expand the story too much, except that instead of taking the train out to California, which is what you would have done in 1938, a friend who was also going to school in Los Angeles had just bought a car, a new car. Not a new car, an old car. A 1931 Dodge Coupe with a rumble seat.
Great.
And Neil and Dan and I drove to California in that car.
How long did it take you?
About 5 days, continuous driving day and night.
Oh, boy.
We didn't stop. We just rotated the drivers. And the rules were no, not over 50 miles an hour. That car wasn't built for that sort of thing, that age.
Nice.
Well, adding to that just a little bit, we decided to go home for Christmas. And the three of us drove that car home, but not only the three of us, but by that time we'd met Dave Johnson. He went with us because he lived in Niagara Falls. That's where his home was.
Oh.
And we had a good friend in the School of Engineering who lived in Albuquerque, a little town of Quebrero, New Mexico, outside of Albuquerque. So 5 of us in this Dodge Coupe with a rumble seat took off, and we dropped Kenny off and visited him on the way, his parents on the way to home. Went on home, got to Buffalo with no strain, left Buffalo on Christmas Eve, or Christmas evening, to get back in time for the Rose Bowl game because I was playing in the band.
Ah, yes.
And I had to get back in time for the game.
Right.
And so we left and we drove straight through, and I think it was something like 3 days, continuous driving, a maximum stop of 15 minutes at any particular time to eat or anything else. It was fun, but we did that back and forth.
And you still had enough energy when you got here to march with the band
In the Rose Parade.
Yes.
And play in the Rose Bowl.
Yes.
I didn't play, but I played the band at the Rose Bowl.
Yes.
Played the sousaphone at that point.
Yes. Wonderful. Tell us about the development and changes in USC's offerings to those interested in cinema and television.
Well, of course, in 1938, when I came to school, it was pretty obvious and made very clear to us by people who spoke from the industry that getting into the industry in Hollywood at that point was a very difficult situation. The industry had become quite organized, and the positions were pretty well taken by young people, and the prognosis of finding a job wasn't all that good.
Surely.
But there were many other fields. Television, of course, hadn't arrived, but
Yes.
films were beginning to play a very important role in education and school systems, a very important role in industry. And there was plenty of work for people who wanted to do that kind of production available all the time, all over the country. And so we weren't deterred from that at all. We just kept on going. At the time we graduated, it was still sort of that way, except the war was on, and the military use of photography and motion pictures, of course, was crucial to what was going on. And after the war, the experience of training films and teaching films and informational films to the public and all that sort of thing were very popular, very well developed, and there was a good field there.
Yes.
So that part of it changed. And in the early days in the school, the program was geared almost directly to the department heads and their philosophy.
Oh, yes.
Shortly after the war, some of the people who were teaching kind of kept it going for a little while, including myself. And then they brought in, they meaning the administration, brought in Slavko Vorkovich as the head of the department. Now, Vorky, as we lovingly call the man, had made a lot of films, but his primary aim, and I don't mean to oversimplify his interests and talents, his primary aim really was making films which would move people, make them feel, as well as hear. Combining music and picture. And his most famous picture was the earthquake sequence from San Francisco.
Yes.
And where when you got through seeing that thing in the early days of sound, really,
Yes.
not really the early days of sound, but the early days of that kind of production,
Yes.
you felt like you'd been through the earthquake. Now today that's standard practice,
Right.
but at that time it was very unique. And he made other films like Forest Murmurs and Fingal's Cave, which took the music and fit visuals to fit the picture. And when you got through, you either felt pacified or you felt riled up by the storm.
Right.
It was very interesting. But that was not really the direction the industry had to go. And the next head of the department was Lester Beck, who was in fact a psychologist. And he had made educational films, best known, I think, for the sex education films that he started with back in the days when that wasn't very popular. But he made a series of those and did very well at it. But he also made all kinds of educational films and understood the whole process of doing it. With Lester and the psychology films, we had a lot of research with government support. Big research contracts. Wasn't always too enthused about what some of the contracts were dealing with, but at the same time, the contracts were dollars coming in and supporting the production program, and some very interesting experiments, such as one that I will never forget. There was a little picture made by the Canadian Film Board called Neighbors. It was two people that lived side by side in a house, and they put a fence up between the two houses, a little picket fence, and the flower came up on one side of the fence. And they began to argue which side of the fence the flower was on. And before they got through, the picture became rather violent. They were fighting each other. It was a more or less animated type film of one of Norman McLaren's special films. But the interesting thing about it is after the picture was done and we used it, we saw it, a research project was developed where they showed that picture to different groups of people and tried to analyze how the audiences reacted to it. And we were experimenting with different ways of measurement of what was going on. Lester Beck, of course, and Nick Rose and other people were running the research part of it, but we had to make it work. And we photographed infrared motion pictures of audiences watching the motion picture. They didn't even know they were being photographed. And you could see their faces and their expressions very, very plainly. And they changed the audiences. They had a group of Sunday school kids. Really? And they had a group of fellows that were brought from the detention. Oh. Different type of people entirely. And they reacted differently. On this particular sequence, when it got violent towards the end, the one group was rather upset, concerned. And the other group laughed and had fun at it. It was a very different approach to it. Well, I could go along Lester Beck and research. After that, it became all education, and it was Jim Finn, it was Bob Hall, and Bernie Cantor was the assistant at the time. Yes. And for 3 or 4 years, we were making educational films. And at that point, Los Angeles City and Los Angeles County had the largest film libraries in the United States. Prints available for schools to be used, and it was a big thing. I'm not surprised. And then, all of a sudden, Bernie Cantor became chairman of the department. Wonderful. And Bernie did the same thing for a little while, but parallel to that is he developed, I think, the approach of contact between the creative side of the industry as well as the business of films, educational training and all that sort of thing. And we began to make contact with a different part of the motion picture industry. And at that era, along in the 60s, which is when he took over, is when a new crew of students came in. They were younger, but they wouldn't take no for an answer. And the George Lucases and the John Millieses and the Ronnie Howards and the, I shouldn't mention names without mentioning all of them, but that can't be. Things like the whole approach of contact to the creative side of the industry changed all of a sudden. And Bernie is the one that helped make that happen. Yes. In parallel to that, we restarted a fraternity that we had in one kind of a way to give honorary degrees, and we gave, I would say, honorary memberships in Delta Kappa Alpha. Oh, yes. And I think my signature is on more certificates and more people's files as the executive secretary of Delta Kappa Alpha, because it wasn't an active organization anymore.
Yes, I see.
But at the same time, we were having banquets at the time over in Town and Gown. People would enter through the faculty center, and the list is from Adolf Zucker and at one end of the scale to, I can't figure the other one at the other end, but there are really hundreds of people. We would take 5 or 6 or 7 at a time for about 10 years, 12 years, long before they were started for the AFI or for any of the other organizations that have since taken on honoring previous people like that. Alfred Hitchcock was more fun when he came down and talked.
I'm sure.
And George Cukor was instrumental in putting these all together with Frank Schaefer, who was Jack Warner's administrative assistant, I guess you'd call him, and his wife, Margaret. They were very helpful. And George Cukor and the whole group putting on, dealing with where people sat and all that sort of problem. And all the presidents of the university were present at those meetings, and we had a big goal for a while. Bernie, I won't go on much beyond the time that Bernie was there. He was there for 16 years, from 1960 to 1976, when he passed away. And at that point, lots of things were happening. This building was being built in 1976. I should say Norris Theater was being built, where my archive collection is located.
Sure.
And in Norris, we had the startings of the archives in the basement of the building.
I see.
But more than that, the theater was equipped for showing films, and we began to have people coming down for classes from the studio talking about the creative films, being able to show them the way they should be. And we, ever since, have been helping the equipment to evolve and the technology to evolve so that it is equal to the best of the theaters, even though it has only 340 seats in it.
Yes.
But I could talk about other people later years, and we'll get to that one after a while.
Who in particular had influence on your preparation for and your advancement in your career?
Well, parallel to all of the things going on at school that I've talked about, I've been very active all my life, really, in groups like the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers. When I joined it in 1942, it was the Society of Motion Picture Engineers. Television wasn't really doing anything. And getting to know the senior people in the industry and the technical side of it, the technology side of it, through that organization, and being on the board of governors of that organization finally, being its secretary, and in later years being its editorial vice president, and then later on being its educational vice president, has certainly been contact with people. I could bring a big list of people, which I, of course, won't do. But all of those people are the people that were doing this sort of thing for the motion picture industry at the time. And having known people like John Frayne and people like Ralph White at Westerex is the pipeline into that part of the field. And I have had close contact with that group. On campus, there are many people. The president. Sure. I got to know Dr. von Kleinsmith a little bit when he was here.
What a wonderful man.
And when I was here, the fact is that we had a Trojan newsreel, which is one of the things that kept us going while we were in school. There wasn't very much in the way of production facilities available at USC.
Yes.
When we arrived, we had a small room in the basement of Old College.
Oh, really?
And an office on the main floor. Yes. And a big change happened when we took over, moved into the old School of Architecture and Fine Arts.
Yes.
And that became cinema. And we had to rebuild the building.
Yes.
With the help of students and with the help of people from the industry giving us advice. and acquiring
I remember
material
that building.
of what to do with that old building.
Yes.
Well, that was the building that people like Lucas and others worked in and did their work. And the building was wide open day and night. The paint was holding it up because I think the termites had eaten most of the wood out from underneath it.
I'm sure.
But, and the mice were there running around the attic all the time. But that building is where we lived from 1940 until 1984, when we moved into this new complex, made possible by the efforts of people like George Lucas and others who, Spielberg. And this room we're shooting this picture in today at the Spielberg scoring stage.
Yes.
At the time had state-of-the-art equipment. And it's still pretty much state-of-the-art because we're changing it as it goes along.
Surely.
But the mixing console, I have pictures of, I happened to run across those last night. Moving that mixing console in the back room into this place, and to have that kind of equipment was a big change from what we had when we started, because there was nothing.
Oh, yes.
They were teaching camera in 1938 with a hand crank debris camera. I don't know where it came from, but it is marked on top, Cine Department, USC, which maybe I can show you later.
Yes.
Sure. At the same
I'd love to
time,
see it.
things have changed.
Yes.
And we were spending 2 years' budget to buy one camera.
Wow.
And I sort of had control of that aspect of steering that sort of thing to go through. And the days when I was managing, shall I say, the business end of it,
True.
managing the budget.
Yes.
Now that sounds different than it really is. It really was. In the early days, you managed the budget by taking the requisition to Dr. von Kleinsmith, and there were two people running the university, as you'll recall.
Right.
Dr. von Kleinsmith and Dr. Oppenheimer.
Yes, indeed.
And one ran the academic side of it, and the other ran the business side of it. When the budget system started and computers came along, all those things were fun to be a part of at the same time.
Oh, yes.
But the people that were involved with all of those things, and along with this technological group that I've been talking about, the SMPTE, there's another group. Starting in 1947, there was an organization formed called the University Film Producers Association. And the University Film Producers Association was exactly that. No schools to speak of. I think NYU had one starting. UCLA didn't have one starting at the time in the earliest days. Theirs came a little later. But these schools had production units, and they were making films for the use of the school, for their programs, for athletics, for engineering, for whoever needed a film made on campus. And the original group was called the University Film Producers Association. And we got involved in many interesting things right through that group at the very beginning.
Sure.
Such as producing films like the series that was made for the USIA, the U.S. Information Agency.
Yeah, I see. Interesting.
We made films. I made one film. One film that I produced, and I'm not proud of it, only because it was 20 minutes long, because that's what it said it had to be, but the story called for an hour. And it was just too brief to be too useful. It was made for NASA on the telescopes and the solar studies that were going on in Hawaii.
Oh, yes.
And NASA wanted some films made, and the universities made them. One group made, from Minnesota, made a picture in Alaska. We happened to draw Hawaii, and others made pictures in Iran.
Oh,
And we sent one crew from our school over to Iran to photograph productions of how to plant an orchard and how to do other things when that was very primitive in that country.
surely.
And putting the crew together, buying the Chevy van, and getting it packed up and shipped, and getting the crew organized was something that I got deeply involved with at that particular time.
Quite a job.
This is rambling a little bit, but at the same time, I think all these things fit together, and the most difficult part is to see how all these little different things that have been happening over the years with the university work together.
Herb, would you expand on some of your other activities?
One of the very interesting things that came from my work in the SMPTE was getting involved with standardization. Now, standardization is not quality standardization exactly. What it is technical standardization. Such things as the width of the film, and the perforations, and interchangeability. In the early days of silent movies, everybody invented their own system and made it proprietary, so you had to buy their equipment to use their film. And in 1916, when the society was formed, one of its goals, along with training and education, one of its goals was actually the standardization of the technology. And in the process of doing that, it was not mandatory. It had to be done by consensus, by everybody agreeing that this was the best way to go, but nobody said you had to go that way.
Sure.
And you can't change some things in the world, such as 60 hertz power in this country, 50 hertz power in Europe, 220 volts standard in Europe, 120 volts standard here.
Yes.
And so you have to learn to live with both of them.
Yes.
Well, that's all been a part of this same standardization process. But now what this has meant, that I first got involved with some standardization in this country in the educational field, and then suddenly found myself getting into international standardization. And at this point, the Japanese people, the German people, the French people, the British people, most of the developed countries, including the Chinese, had their own thoughts, and they still wanted standards. And I became active in an international standards committee and made several trips to Munich and to various foreign countries in the early days. And then I found myself elected later on as chairman of that committee for the international group, with its headquarters in Geneva and with the SMPTE and myself involved with it. Now, standardization is divided into two parts in this country, and I won't bother with the details too much, except that ISO is standardization of technology and everything else except electronic material. And so I found near the end of my term that the whole system was changing. It was getting into video and digital and electronics. And I had to make a decision at that time whether I was going to, I couldn't stay in the standards work. The time you can do it is limited to 10 years. And when I started, it was audiovisual as I knew it. And I can certainly accept, and I can hear it, and I appreciate the difference and the improvement. And I'm glad people are doing it who are really into that sort of thing. It's like learning to use the computer.
Surely.
I bought my first computer in 1979, got delivered in January of 1980. That was an Apple II computer.
Oh.
And the IBM original computer for home use hadn't been invented yet,
Yes.
or at least made available.
Yes.
And I've been at it ever since. Well, I'm amazed at how my granddaughters can run their computers.
Yes, ma'am.
It makes all the sense in the world, and they have no problems making it work.
Yes.
And I manage to do what I want to do with it for the most part, but it's a slow process.
Herb, I'm sure with your extensive activities, you've received a number of honors and awards. Are there any in which you take particular pride?
Well, I am pleased to have received recognition off and on from many organizations and over a great period of time. They're not the kind of awards that have a lot of money involved, but they are a sincere recognition, shall I say, of hard work in the interests of the future and the young people that are working to get ready for that future. Probably the one that I'm most proud of is the Eastman Kodak Gold Medal.
Yes.
And in 1976, I had finished a couple of terms as educational vice president of the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers, and we had a quite good educational program going, and I ended up being the recipient that year. I meant to bring it today,
Yes.
which I might bring over to the archives just so you can see what it looks like, because it's a rather interesting piece of gold, and it's solid gold. But at the same time, that's not why it's important. It's important because in company with a lot of other people who have been working to help education over the years, one year had my name tied to it.
Do you have any predictions for the future of the industry, which you have been so involved and so influential?
I think it's pretty obvious one of these changes that's happening is it is becoming almost instantly worldwide. There was a point when the United States sort of had a corner on the market for a great deal of it. But every country is using it for all of its purposes, and television is an international thing. Communication is instantaneous around the world. I think the prediction is it's going to be more of that, and it's going to be more digital. It's not quite there. They haven't solved some of the problems of longevity, if I can call it that, preservation. There are still problems in magnetic recording. There are still problems on the materials that we use. They're being improved all the time. We like to think that the video disc type of thing is permanent, but it hasn't been around long enough to know. We do know that we have film that is 100 years old and can be still shown.
Yes.
We also know that we have tapes that were recorded 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when tape recording really got started in this whole thing. It can't be played anymore because there's no equipment available to play it.
True.
And so when people have their home movies shot on 8mm, and they want to have it transferred to video, I say that's fine. Do it. Go ahead, transfer it. Don't destroy the original.
No.
Because it can still be copied.
True.
And that is pretty good advice, I think.
Do you have any predictions for changes at the USC School of Cinema Television, the university in general, such as student populations and interests and emphases?
Well, I certainly think that SC is on the right track. I've always thought they were. When I came as a student, we had many students from India in cinema.
Really?
And those people went back to India to run the industry over there, really. And I read about some of them on occasion. But today, with all the international students that we have here, I think it's great. I think that it's what it takes to understand all the cultures and the people of the world. And having visited many of the countries and had the chance to go not as a tourist, but in a professional sense, I think that's the way the world is going to change anyway. I think there's got to be more of that kind of thing.
Surely.
And I think the university is hard at it. They're doing it right.
Great. What are your views on the current facilities at USC?
A very interesting question. When we designed the building, we wanted to build it, and we got permission to design the building in such a way that it would be certainly flexible. But little did we have any concept of what was going to happen, how it was going to change over the years. These 5 buildings that were built in 1984, opened just before the Olympic, were considered state-of-the-art at the time, as far ahead as you could get. But little did we know what was going to happen to the technology. We couldn't have guessed, I don't think. Each one of the buildings has undergone major changes. At the present time, we're in the Spielberg scoring stage. When it was completed in 1984, it was state-of-the-art. When it was equipped, it was current equipment. My favorite saying is that mixing console alone in the sound control room is no change out of $500,000. And it is fast becoming obsolete because things are going digital. And yet the acoustics in this place are ideal. We can change the walls, so it's a live room, so it's a dead room, so it's very nice for music, for piano, for whatever's going on, for an orchestra. And strange as it may seem, although it isn't a big room, it's very adequate for about a 35-piece symphony orchestra. You know, they do a good job of recording in here. But students record their own material. The students operate the equipment, and that's part of the system. The Spielberg stage is in the process of being updated some more every year.
Yes, I'm sure.
So it goes.
Yes.
The rest of the building, down below and on the other side, is undergoing changes. This past year, we needed to remove our black and white motion picture processing laboratory, much as I hated to see it go.
Sure.
We always had a laboratory, but the state of the art says the lab isn't going to last too long, and it wasn't worth buying a brand new one for our purposes, when what we really need is space for computers.
Sure.
And so what used to be the motion picture processing lab now has 30 very high-level computers in some aspect of computer animation or computer graphics, which is what the students today are going to be getting into when they leave here. The projection facilities are still film in many of the rooms, but we've added video to it.
I see.
And the projection facilities for film get used a little less, although we use it more than most people because we have quite a collection in the archives and can acquire quite a collection of films to show.
Sure.
Animation has changed its computers. Editing has changed. It's no longer moviola machines and synchronizers. Not that they're not used to some extent, but it's done on video.
Yes.
Editing is done on video, like this tape is going to be edited on video.
Sure.
It never will go through all those stages and processes. Some of us are concerned that the students don't learn as much about dealing with film first. But realistically, I think we all recognize that that's not going to last forever.
Yes.
It's going to change. And when that happens, the students that come from here will be ready for it.
Surely.
They will have had enough of it so that they know what film is,
Surely.
and they appreciate it. But at the same time, they know what video can do and what digital
Right.
and computers can do and what are going to be doing worldwide.
Now let's take a trip and sig over to your bailiwicking home in the basement of Norris Theater, Herb.
Good idea.
Good.
Great.
Herb, it's been a short trip over to the film television archives, your home. How about telling us a little about some of your fantastic treasures?
The toughest part of this whole thing, Harry, is figuring out what not to tell you about. There is so much here, so much that I'd like to talk about. However, we started the archive concept at the time that this theater was being built. We'd been saving old equipment when the old building was being occupied, and we've been accepting gifts of people. Some of these things that we have actually came as gifts to the university even then, but we had no place to take care of it properly. But then, when we were building Norris Theater, we planned for an archive in the basement, and Mrs. Norris bought the idea, and Bernie Cantor and I spent a good deal of time figuring out what we might put down here and how we might do it. We'd been having gifts from people like Saul Lesser. Saul Lesser had been collecting equipment for the Hollywood Museum, which hasn't been built yet. But he was looking for a home for it. The time had come when he couldn't take it with him, and he offered it to the university. At that point, we accepted the gift and put it in storage at Beacons and paid storage on it for about 20 years before we had this place available. Other people had given us equipment, and it was stored in the basement of the theater when it was built. But we kept on adding things to it until the new building was completed over here, and we had to get out of the old one because a lot of it still was in the old cinema building over where the Levy Library is at the present time. With all that equipment, it just kept getting moved down here. And then we had to begin to organize it and take care of it. In the basement, we also had a lot of stuff from the library. This was a storage area for the cinema television collection in the cinema library. We finally went to work and began to get organized here and build shelves and cages and get it so we can find things. And the first priority was on films. We have all the student films from almost the beginning, almost all of them. We have the negatives for them, the originals. And when we needed to make new prints of George Lucas's film, when he got his honorary degree, we made new prints of all of his student films. He wasn't too happy about some of them, but they were good learning experiences and they were well received. But anyway, we've been collecting all this equipment. We're beginning to now get it organized. And I will not talk about the film part of it that much more, except that it's the major part of the library in space. We're pretty well concentrated, but there are thousands of items of camera equipment, projection equipment, audiovisual equipment, and magic lanterns and early motion picture equipment, including the toys, which have been made over the years for this field. The last 100 years is all part of it. Actually, the earliest part of the motion picture business started, not motion pictures, but the magic lantern business started with hand-drawn original material. This one's from Jack and the Beanstalk. Hand-drawn because photography hadn't been invented yet. That didn't come till about 1850, when the daguerreotype cameras were made, which we have 2 of. But these hand drawings were used in magic lanterns and traveling shows all the time. Photography became a reality when flexible film was invented in the late last century, second last century, 1880, 1890, along when flexible film was made. That made possible still photography for the amateur. It made possible motion pictures for the profession and the amateur. And it's been here with us until now when times are changing. But you've all seen things like the stereoscope in your grandmother's living room. This is the camera that was used to make stereoscopic pictures. A sample of one. We have quite a few in the collection of that 2-lens type. Early portable cameras. I could show you how the shutter works, but I won't bother at this point. And early plate cameras. But on motion pictures, people had taken magic lanterns that were designed for showing still pictures. First that kind, later actual photographs, hand-colored, and showing them on a slide projector on a traveling show basis or in the living room. That was home movies in the old days, if you had a camera that would take the pictures. But then they began to build machinery to adapt this equipment for showing motion pictures. And the optograph came along, of which we have a number of examples. This is one of the earlier ones, and this is one of the last optographs that was made, which would fit in front of the slide projector, and you could actually use the same machine for showing little pieces of motion pictures or pretty good sized rolls. Generally speaking, it was made for safety film. But you'd be amazed the number of kids, like one that I know particularly, who used to show nitrate film in the basement of our house when I was first getting interested in this whole thing. However, the motion picture business got started as we know it today about 1895. We happen to have a Lumiere, the French projector, and a couple of the Edison projectors. They both showed film, silent movies. They had a light source, and you had to turn the crank to make it work, and there's a crank that turns this one the same way. And there's a question that people talk about every so often of where it all started. Who was first? Everybody had these going for quite a few years. But the French were first in one thing, and that is they were the first to charge a nickel to go see it. They were the showmen, because Thomas Edison was probably building what I think is a little better machine, but at the same time, his primary interest was in his phonograph, not in motion pictures. And he wasn't sure they were going to last. Well, he missed on that one too. But he made a lot of other ones. Speaking of projectors for theaters, let's look at a couple of others while we're here. And this is a Pathé for a projector that theoretically was used in the Tally Electric Theater in 1906 on Lower Main Street in Los Angeles, according to the documentation that came with it. I obviously wasn't there at the time. It might seem like I was, but that's not the case. Actually, it's solid brass construction, except for the intermittent mechanism, and the operator had to turn the crank. This was usually out in the audience. The film came off of a core, just no spool, no reel, and took up in a wastebasket. And they were usually short films, and they could have several of them sitting on here ready to go. This next machine is a Powers 5 projector, vintage of about 1912, and it's a portable projector in that it came apart in pieces and was made for moving from town to town, venue to venue, if you will, in modern language. But the magazines get bigger as we go, and at least it has a magazine around the outside. And this was frequently nitrate film on those machines. But the operator, in this particular case, since he was in the audience, had to deal with not only the projector, threading it, running it, the arc lamp, keeping it going, and the sound effects that go with it. Nice machinery. This one comes a little later, 1912 to 1916, along in there. The American Standard projector. This was a theater projector type machine in a small projection booth in the theater area, rather than out in the audience, as were the first two machines. Still a carbon arc, still a hand crank projector. The projections in the old days used to feel that they had to vary the speed of the projector in order to be a part of the show. And they did. It could run slow and it could run fast, and they could change. And they resented when sound came and they couldn't have that creative part of the program. This last machine started about 1916 and was built right on up to 1930 with improvements and modifications along the way. Powers 6 projector with many improvements year after year after year on the thing. The last improvement, so to speak, was when they added a sound head in between the picture head and the base, and now they had sound films. So the same projector was used for both, and of course in those days they had to modify the machine and install a motor drive system. And the operators had to give up their ability to change the speed of the machine, which they didn't like, but they did. They had to. With that, let's go down to the camera department at the other end of the building. And here we are, Harry, at the beginning of the camera section. And this particular bay is all American-made cameras that have certain elements of history that go with them. The first two are newsreel cameras, and we can talk about those if you want to, universal cameras. But then the Selig camera, the Lubin camera, and the Bell and Howell camera. The thing that's unique about the Bell and Howell camera is its number 3. They made 8 of these all together in 1906, and 1 and 2 have been lost. That's fairly well documented. So I think this is the oldest one in captivity. I do know that Eastman House has one, and a friend of mine in Massachusetts has one. But this is, I think, the oldest Bell and Howell camera in existence. This camera has a rather interesting bit of history to it. It was made by C. Francis Jenkins. And he was the first president of the SMPTE back when it was the SMPE. No television, obviously, in 1916. And these 2 cameras are made by Cronk Brothers. Actually, this one looks like it's never been used. I don't think it's reconstructed. It's just like a brand new one. This one is thoroughly used, and I can't tell you what pictures it's photographed. Now, the equipment in the front is related. It's all American made, but it has a different part of the history. This particular camera is the one which I brought with me when I came to USC. It didn't look like this when I came with it. It looked almost like this one, with the 3 lenses, the old-fashioned viewfinder, none of the fine points like the hand crank and the magazine mount and all that sort of thing. But this photographed the Trojan newsreel. It photographed football films. It photographed many things for years. And finally I turned it over and gave it to the school, and the students used it. And we kept improving the lenses and improving the whole business. But near the end of its existence as a student camera, we had installed an Angelo 17 to 68 zoom lens on it with the finder built in. And this is before that was available as a standard option even from Bell & Howell. And these were used until we could afford enough Aeroflex cameras to take care of the needs of the students. But it's good to have this back in the collection simply because it started 60mm production, as far as I'm concerned, at USC in 1938 when I brought it out here. Later on, we began to add Cine Special cameras. This Kodak Cine Special was one of about 10 that we had finally for the graduate and the advanced productions. We couldn't afford production cameras even in those days, but these worked very well, and you could buy blimps and all the things to go with them so you could use it. Worked pretty well. And these are certain items of editing equipment. And this particular gadget I like to show because when they were talking about sound in 1934 to 36 to 38, the demonstrations were pretty primitive. And you hooked up your vacuum tubes and you learned how they worked by doing it yourself in the very principles. But we didn't have any of the sophisticated equipment that existed at that point. The smallest camera in our collection happens to be this one. And I think it's the smallest camera ever made that's a working camera. It's 3mm film. Not only do we have the camera, but Eric Berndt, who made it, also gave us the machine for making the film, taking 60mm film and slitting it, perforating it, for developing it, for enlarging it up to 60mm so you could show it. And we have an 8mm projector which he converted to show this film. The picture is like a pinhead. Ostensibly it was for instrument recording purposes. I suspect that he had in the back of his mind perhaps surveillance purposes in banks and that sort of thing. But the fact is, along came videotape. And the day videotape came along and took over that business, this kind of went on the back shelf. But the equipment is all here that goes with it. This, I think, the smallest one in captivity. Let's move on to the next section. And here we are on the one display I have of set-up cameras completely. The first one we're looking at is the Akeley camera. This particular one is unique. This particular model is unique in that it had 2 lenses, matched lenses, and one was on the finder and one was on the taking lens.
I see.
It wasn't a stereo at all.
Yes.
The man that made these was an African explorer, wild animals, and he made it for taking on location
For goodness
overseas.
sake. Yes.
Amazing.
And we've quite
It's a
something to
hand
carry
crank
around.
camera. It's unique in that there's a gyro on the head.
Oh, yes.
You probably can't hear it, but it's hard to get a bad pan or a bad tilt because there's a gyro on each one of them. This other camera is another universal like the ones we saw earlier. Later, known by the fact that it's made by the Universal Camera Company, division of Burke and James.
Oh, yes.
And Burke and James had bought it out, and they began to use this tripod, which
I
was
see.
unique at that era. So this tripod goes with this particular model of this camera.
Mm-hmm.
The next one has a little history to it, which we can't ignore. It is actually a French camera, a debris camera. The thing that's unique about it, it was used by USC in instruction. It was a course taught by an older gentleman, about my age when I was a student here. He was an old cameraman, but he knew how to do it, and how to crank the camera, how to handle the adjustments while you're doing it. At the same time, deal with two cranks, because the pan and the tilt were both done by cranks, because if you used a freehead tripod, like we have, it'd be wiggling back and forth as you turned the crank. He taught us so many interesting things. You don't turn the crank this way. You have to turn the crank this way. That way, it's more consistent.
Surely. I see.
And of course, you have to be able to vary the speed of the cranking, depending upon the scene, and what the effect you want.
Right.
Crank it fast and you get slow motion. Crank it slow and you get fast motion. Anyway.
I notice it does say Cinema Department USC.
Yes, it
on
does.
the top.
It was in the stock room, in the equipment room. We used to call it the stock room,
Yes.
but in the equipment room. And it's a rather unique piece of machinery. I wish I had time to show you the one that I have opened up, threaded, so you can see how it works.
One day.
But that'll be one of these days when you come back. And the last two cameras we're going to talk about are the Bell & Howell 2709 and the NC Mitchell. The Bell & Howell 2709 was made starting in about 1909. And actually, Bell & Howell made 8 cameras like the one you saw, number 3.
Right.
And then they quit for about 2 years. It took all the advice from the people who had used that camera and put it into this one.
Oh, yes.
And they got a very steady movement. The picture is rock steady, and it's still used. It's still very good for animation purposes. Noisy, very noisy. At the same time, there's a big difference in the rack-over system. Sliding the camera back and forth so that you turn the lens on one way and you can ride the camera over and look through the lens and see what you're photographing. Then you turn the turret 180 degrees, slide the camera back, and the same lens is in the taking position. And that was nice.
I should say.
It was good. However, it was very, very tedious to use, cumbersome. And it was noisy. And the camera lasted for quite a while, but it was replaced by the Mitchell camera. And the Mitchell camera took all the faults of the Bell & Howell 2709 that people mentioned and made a camera which was quieter, which did a lot of things. It's heavier. And it's a good piece of machinery.
It looks heavier.
It is. Just try picking it up.
I don't think
the
I
tripod weighs as much as some of these things do. However, that's the way it goes. If it came with all accessories and the lenses, and it all depended on how good the lenses were, how good the pictures were. And it had a wonderful improvement in the rack-over system to shift between having this lens in the viewfinder position here and over in the taking position here.
I see.
Much more convenient for the cameraman.
Surely.
So they made up for all the shortcomings of this one. This took over the business. And it was the standard for many, many years. But that, too, has come to an end with some of the modern machinery, and even more so with a thing called digital in the modern TV cameras, which are very, very different. Well, it's been fun sharing this little bit with you. It's just the beginning. I wish we could take
I'm sure we could go on for many hours, Herb.
Days.
And days, indeed. But this has been, well, I'll say awe-inspiring, and what wonderful historical materials you have here.
Well, it's wonderful to have the material here and have it preserved. That's my primary purpose. In the past, and up to the present, and in the future.
Indeed.
The first obligation is to preserve it. And secondly, to make it available to people who want to study it, and want to see it, and want to know about it. You know, it's rather interesting to have this much storage space with this much kind of equipment as close to the President's office as it's located.
Oh, yes, I'm sure.
On this campus, where real estate is so valuable.
Yes, indeed.
To have it here is wonderful.
Oh, yes.
And I just hope that it will keep on growing, and someday we'll figure out how to make it available to be viewed by the public who are interested.
I would be because I feel privileged to have had the contact with the archives that I've had so far. It's absolutely fascinating. And Herb, I want you to know that I value our continuing friendship. I offer you my thanks and thanks on behalf of the Emeritus Center and the university for you so willingly accepting the invitation to talk about what you have done, your visions of the university, your memories, and of your home, the archives. We do
Probably
thank
should
you
have been
so
able
much.
to do it.
Again, my friend.